This model ties one of the best coding systems on the planet, and it runs on Chinese chips, not NVIDIA's. The company that everyone said couldn't compete without American hardware just gave the world a frontier-class model for free, and that breaks a core assumption the West was betting on. Here's how. For years, the plan was simple. Choke China's access to the best AI chips, and you choke their ability to build and run frontier models. No top hardware, no competition, except it didn't fully work. In April, this lab shipped a model that ties Google's best on coding, priced it at a fraction of the competition, and open sourced the whole thing. Meanwhile, the company doing it has a fraction of the money and a fraction of the compute of the giants it's beating. So either the ban is failing or something far more interesting is going on. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what they pulled off, the handicap they were given, the tricks that made the model this efficient, and the part that should genuinely worry Silicon Valley. First, the handicap. The export controls mean China can't buy NVIDIA's best chips. What they can get are deliberately weakened versions. Same silicon, throttled. Now here's the part people skip. Training a giant AI model is not one chip doing the work. It's thousands of them, wired together, constantly passing notes to each other. Picture a huge kitchen with 1,000 cooks. The food only comes out fast if the cooks can shout orders across the room instantly. The ban doesn't take away the cooks. It makes them whisper. Slow down how fast they talk, and the whole kitchen crawls. That's the pressure these labs are under. But before we crown them the scrappy underdog, let me push back on the story, because most videos won't. These labs are not as starved as the headlines pretend. This one grew out of a hedge fund that quietly stockpiled chips years before the bans landed. Estimates put their hardware in the tens of thousands of high-end units. Smuggling is real, renting compute abroad is real, and by their own account, they still used NVIDIA chips to train this thing. So the phrase "no good chips" comes with a fat asterisk. The handicap is real. It's just not the whole story. And yet, the pressure was real enough to force them down a completely different road. Picture cooking in a kitchen where someone keeps stealing your sharpest knives. You can complain. Or you can get so good with the cheap ones that the expensive knives stop mattering. That second path is the entire reason we're having this conversation. So let's open the hood on the tricks that made it work. Trick 1. Here's the problem with almost every AI model. It's wasteful by design. When a normal model writes a single word, it wakes up its entire brain to do it. Every part firing for every word. If you have unlimited chips, who cares? It's like running a company where, for every single customer question, all 100,000 employees cram into one room to answer it. Absurd. But if compute is free, you get away with it. They did not have unlimited chips. So their model is built as a mixture of experts, and the name is almost the whole idea. Instead of one giant brain firing all at once, the model is carved into a huge team of specialists. A little manager sits at the front door. A question about Python code comes in. The manager doesn't wake the whole building. It taps the handful of experts who actually know code and sends everyone else back to their desks. So look at the scale here. On paper, this brain is enormous, 1.6 trillion parameters. But for any single word it writes, it only switches on about 49 billion of them, around 1 in 30, nearly the full intelligence for a tiny slice of the running cost. But that trick has a hidden failure mode, and how they fixed it is trick 2. Think about that manager at the door again. If a few experts are just really good, the manager keeps sending everyone to them. Those star experts get swamped, while most of the building sits idle. Your expensive hardware half asleep, everyone crowding the one employee they like. If that gets bad enough, the whole system collapses onto a handful of overworked experts, and the model stops learning properly. The usual fix is to punish the model whenever it plays favorites. But that punishment is a leash. It forces balance by dragging the model away from its best choices, and it makes the model a little bit dumber in the process. So DeepSeek threw the leash out. Instead of punishing the popular experts, they give each expert a quiet dial. Watch the traffic during training. If an expert is getting swamped, turn its dial down a touch, so the manager picks it slightly less. If an expert is sitting idle, nudge its dial up so it gets pulled into the room more often. No leash, no penalty, no lost intelligence. Just a gentle, constant rebalancing that keeps every chip busy without ever forcing a dumb decision. That is the difference between a model that fights its own hardware and one that flows across it. Now trick 3, and this one is about memory. Here's something nobody tells you about these models. The longer your conversation gets, the more the model has to hold in its head, and that memory is brutally expensive. Every word you've said, it keeps a running set of notes on. Think of a waiter taking a very long order. A normal model writes down every single word you say in full on a giant pad. By the end, that pad is enormous, and just carrying it around is what slows everything down and eats memory. So V4 rebuilt how it takes notes. Instead of the full transcript, it uses a heavily compressed shorthand that still captures everything that matters. The result is staggering. On a million token conversation, this model uses only about a tenth of the memory the previous version needed, and roughly a quarter of the raw computation per word. Same understanding, a fraction of the weight. That is the difference between a model that chokes on a long document and one that breezes through it on cheaper hardware. Now you might be thinking, cheap is nice, but is it actually any good? So let's talk about how these models get tested, because the number here is the whole reason anyone panicked. There's a benchmark called SWE Bench, and it is brutal. It doesn't ask the model trivia. It hands the model real open bug reports from actual software projects, the kind a human engineer gets assigned on a Monday morning and says, fix it, find the bug across a sprawling codebase, write the patch, and make sure the tests pass. For years, this was exactly the kind of task everyone assumed only the top Western models could touch. This model solves around 80% of them. That ties it with Google's best, an open, free Chinese model doing frontier-level engineering work on the hardest practical coding test we have. That's the moment the number stops being a spec sheet and starts being a threat. And here's the payoff that ties all of this together. Because they were forced to squeeze every drop of efficiency, the model isn't just cheaper to build, it's cheaper to run every single time anyone uses it forever. How much cheaper? Per word of output, this model is roughly 30 times cheaper than the flagship from Anthropic, and over 30 times cheaper than the top model from OpenAI. The labs swimming in hardware never had a reason to care about that. This lab had no choice, and the handicap turned into a permanent cost advantage over the very people who imposed it. Now there's one accusation we have to deal with, because it's the first thing skeptics throw out. Did they just copy the West? There's a real technique called distillation. In plain terms, you take a genius model, ask it millions of questions, and train your cheaper model to imitate the answers, learning from the master's work instead of figuring it out yourself. And American labs have formally accused this company, along with other Chinese labs, of doing exactly that, harvesting outputs from Western models at scale. The lab denies it, and here's the honest part. Some learning from Western models almost certainly happened. It's common across the industry, but an outright copy that explains a full frontier model running on a new architecture on Chinese hardware, that's a much bigger claim, and the public evidence doesn't stretch that far. They built something real. The accusation and the achievement can both be true at once. So step back and look at what actually happened. This model runs on Chinese chips, Huawei's, not NVIDIA's. For years, the assumption was that even if China could train a model, they'd still need NVIDIA to run it at scale. Every query, forever, flowing back to American hardware. V4 is the proof that assumption is cracking. The one part of the stack the West was most confident it owned, deployment, is the part slipping. And it gets worse for the incumbents. A model built this efficiently is cheap for everyone to run, which means they can undercut Western prices by more than an order of magnitude and still make money. So the ban, meant to slow China down, may have quietly done the opposite. It forced them to get brilliant at the one thing everyone else got lazy about: efficiency. That's the answer to the question we started with. How does a lab keep up with rivals many times its size? They were handicapped into being better, hands tied behind their back and still landing punches. Now, to be clear, this does not mean China has taken the lead. The West still holds the frontier and holds it well, especially in the hardest part, training the biggest models from scratch. But the gap is closing from behind, under handicap, and that changes the entire game from here. This was one move on the board. Next time, we go deeper into how these models are trained on a shoestring and the chip war brewing underneath all of it. If you want the rest of the story, you know what to do. I'll see you there.